Welcome back, folks. Before we dive in, here's a quick refresher on where we left off. The world had just stumbled into the deadliest conflict in human history through a chain of events almost too dramatic to believe. A brutal peace treaty after World War I had crushed Germany under economic ruin and humiliation, opening the door for a failed artist named Adolf Hitler to rise to absolute power. Western leaders, terrified of another war, tried to appease him and watched in horror as he gobbled up Czechoslovakia, then invaded Poland in September 1939, kicking off World War II. From there, the Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. France fell in just 6 weeks. Britain stood completely alone, fighting for its life in the skies during the Battle of Britain. Hitler then made his most reckless gamble of the entire war, turning east and invading the Soviet Union with the largest army ever assembled. And just when it seemed like the conflict couldn't get any bigger, Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, dragging the United States into the fight and turning two regional wars into one truly global catastrophe. That's where we left off. Now here's where the story gets even darker, even bloodier, and frankly, even more unbelievable. Buckle up, because this is the second half of the deadliest war in human history. To truly understand what happened, folks need to know that the Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers. It began with words. From the moment Hitler took power in 1933, the Nazi regime started a slow, deliberate campaign to dehumanize Germany's Jewish population, first through propaganda, then through laws, and finally through violence. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of their German citizenship and forbade them from marrying non-Jews. Jewish doctors lost their patients, Jewish lawyers lost their practices, Jewish children were thrown out of schools. Then came Kristallnacht in November 1938, the night of broken glass, when Nazi mobs torched synagogues, smashed Jewish-owned businesses, and murdered nearly 100 Jews in the streets, while German police stood by and watched. Once the war began, the persecution shifted from cruelty into something far more sinister. As German armies swept through Poland and the Soviet Union, special killing units called Einsatzgruppen followed right behind them. Their job was as straightforward as it was monstrous. Round up Jews, communists, and intellectuals in every captured village, march them into nearby forests or ravines, and shoot them. By the end of 1941, these mobile death squads had murdered over 1 million people, mostly through mass executions. The most infamous incident took place at Babi Yar, just outside Kiev, where 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were shot in just 2 days. But here's the chilling part. Even this industrial-scale slaughter wasn't fast enough for the Nazi leadership. They wanted something more efficient. On January 20th, 1942, 15 senior Nazi officials gathered at a comfortable lakeside villa in a Berlin suburb called Wannsee. Over coffee and brandy, surrounded by elegant furniture and warm fireplaces, they spent 90 minutes calmly discussing the logistics of murdering 11 million European Jews. The meeting was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, one of the coldest and most chilling figures of the entire Nazi regime. The decisions made at that table would become known as the final solution to the Jewish question. It's hard to wrap one's head around the casual bureaucracy of it. How regular men in suits, drinking coffee, treated the extermination of an entire people like a corporate logistics problem. Train schedules were drafted, quotas were set, construction plans were approved. Genocide had become a department. What followed was the construction of a system designed for one purpose only: death on an industrial scale. Camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec became factories of murder, complete with railway lines, gas chambers disguised as showers, and crematoria running day and night. Families arrived after days locked in cattle cars, exhausted and starving. Within hours, mothers, fathers, grandparents, and children were separated, stripped, and gassed. Their bodies were burned, their hair was shaved for industrial use, their gold teeth were pried out for the Reichsbank. Some prisoners were kept alive briefly as slave labor, worked until they collapsed, then murdered too. The scale defies imagination. At Auschwitz alone, over 1 million people were killed, most of them within hours of arrival. By the time the camps were finally liberated in 1945, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children had been systematically murdered, roughly 2/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe. Alongside them died millions of others the Nazis deemed undesirable: Roma people, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish intellectuals, disabled individuals, gay men, political dissidents, and Jehovah's Witnesses. When Allied soldiers walked into places like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, hardened combat veterans broke down and wept at what they saw. General Eisenhower personally toured a death camp and ordered every detail filmed and photographed, telling his men, "Get it all on record now. Get the films. Get the witnesses. Because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." That warning, sadly, would prove prophetic. But while the horror of the camps unfolded in Europe, on the other side of the planet, a very different kind of war was being fought across thousands of miles of ocean, one tiny, blood-soaked island at a time. After Pearl Harbor, the Pacific became a battlefield unlike any the world had ever seen. Forget the muddy trenches of Europe or the snowy plains of Russia. This was a war fought across the largest ocean on Earth, where the distances between battles were measured in thousands of miles. In the months following the attack, Japan went on a stunning rampage. They captured the Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and dozens of strategic islands. The fall of Singapore in February 1942, where 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered, was the single largest capitulation in British military history. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched across an area larger than the entire United States, and it looked unstoppable. Then came the moment that quietly changed everything: the Battle of Midway in June 1942. American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval cipher and figured out that Admiral Yamamoto was planning a massive ambush at Midway Atoll, hoping to lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap and finish the job he'd started at Pearl Harbor. But this time, the Americans had the trap waiting for him. 3 U.S. carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, lay in ambush. In a brutal 5-minute window of dive bomber attacks, American pilots sank 3 Japanese carriers. A 4th went down later that day. Japan lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of its most experienced pilots in a single afternoon. The tide of the Pacific War had just turned, and Japan would never recover. After Midway, U.S. military planners came up with a strategy that was as clever as it was ruthless: island hopping. Instead of trying to capture every Japanese-held island in the Pacific, which would have taken decades and cost millions of lives, the Americans would skip the most heavily fortified ones, leaving them isolated and starving, while targeting strategically important islands that could serve as stepping stones toward Japan itself. The first big test came at Guadalcanal in August 1942, where U.S. Marines landed in dense, fever-soaked jungle and fought one of the most grueling 6-month campaigns of the entire war. The Japanese fought to the last man, often refusing to surrender, embracing a code of death before dishonor that would shape every battle to come. Each island brought a new nightmare. At Tarawa in 1943, Marines waded ashore through chest-deep water under withering machine gun fire, suffering 3,000 casualties in just 76 hours. At Saipan in 1944, civilians threw themselves off cliffs rather than be captured by Americans, after Japanese propaganda convinced them the Marines were monsters. And then there was Iwo Jima in February 1945, an 8-square-mile volcanic rock that produced one of the most iconic images in American history: 6 Marines raising the stars and stripes atop Mount Suribachi. But that photo doesn't show the cost. Nearly 7,000 Marines died taking that island, and almost the entire Japanese garrison of 21,000 fought to the death. Then came Okinawa in April 1945, where over 12,000 Americans and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians lost their lives in just 3 months. By the summer of 1945, American forces were standing at Japan's doorstep. The home islands were within range of B-29 bombers flying from captured airfields, and Tokyo was being firebombed into ashes. A single raid in March 1945 killed over 100,000 civilians in one night, more than would die in either of the atomic bombings to come. But here's the brutal calculation American planners were facing. Every island battle had been worse than the last. Japanese resistance was fanatical, with kamikaze pilots crashing planes into Allied ships and soldiers vowing to fight to the last man, woman, and child to defend the homeland. U.S. military planners estimated that an invasion of the Japanese mainland could cost 1 million American casualties and several million Japanese lives. The war in the Pacific was racing toward a climax nobody fully imagined yet. And while the Marines were bleeding their way across coral atolls, the Allies had been hard at work in completely different theaters, first in the deserts of Africa, then on the rocky beaches of Italy. While the Pacific raged and the Eastern Front bled, a very different kind of war was being fought in a very different kind of place, the burning sands of North Africa. To understand why anyone was fighting in the middle of a desert, folks need to remember one critical thing: the Suez Canal. That narrow strip of water in Egypt was the lifeline of the British Empire, the shortcut connecting Britain to its oil supplies in the Middle East and its colonies in India. If the Axis could grab the Suez, Britain's entire imperial economy would collapse overnight. So when Italy's Benito Mussolini, eager to play conqueror like his buddy Hitler, invaded Egypt from Italian-controlled Libya in 1940, the war for the desert was officially on. The Italian invasion was frankly a disaster. British and Commonwealth forces pushed back so hard and so fast that Mussolini begged Hitler for help. Enter Erwin Rommel, the same general whose panzers had torn through France just months earlier. Hitler shipped him to Africa in 1941 with a small German force called the Afrika Korps, and within weeks, this guy was running circles around the British. The Brits started calling him the Desert Fox out of grudging respect. He was bold, fast, and seemed to read his opponent's minds. For nearly 2 years, the war in North Africa swung back and forth across the desert like a tennis match. British forces would push west, Rommel would counterattack and push them east. Then they'd push him back again. Tank battles raged across landscapes so empty they almost looked like the surface of the moon. The turning point came in October 1942, at a tiny Egyptian railway stop nobody had heard of called El Alamein. The British Eighth Army, now under the careful, methodical command of General Bernard Montgomery, had been quietly building up overwhelming superiority. More tanks, more guns, more men, and crucially, an absolute mountain of supplies. Rommel, on the other hand, was running on fumes, with his fuel and ammunition stretched dangerously thin across thousands of miles of supply lines. When Monty unleashed his offensive on the night of October 23rd, the British smashed through Rommel's defenses in 12 grueling days of fighting. It was the first major land victory for the Western Allies, and Churchill captured the moment with one of his classic lines. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. Then came Operation Torch in November 1942, the first major American ground offensive of the war. U.S. forces, led by a tough, no-nonsense general named Dwight D. Eisenhower, landed in Morocco and Algeria, while British forces pushed from the east. Caught in a giant pincer movement, the Axis forces in Africa were squeezed tighter and tighter until they cracked. By May 1943, over 230,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, a defeat almost as devastating as Stalingrad. The Allies had cleared an entire continent of Axis power, and just as importantly, the Americans and British had figured out how to fight together as a team. The next logical question was simple: where would they hit Hitler next? The answer was Italy, what Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. Spoiler alert, that underbelly turned out to be a lot tougher than advertised. The Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, and the shock of seeing American and British troops on Italian soil triggered a political earthquake in Rome. Within weeks, Mussolini was overthrown, arrested, and the new Italian government secretly negotiated surrender. But Hitler wasn't about to let Italy slip away. German forces poured down the peninsula, rescued Mussolini in a daring commando raid, and turned Italy into a brutal mountain war. The Allies slogged northward through places that became legendary for their bloodshed: Salerno, Anzio, and the monastery of Monte Cassino, where Polish, American, British, French, and Indian troops fought 4 separate battles to break through. Italy didn't fall fast, but it did one critical thing. It kept hundreds of thousands of German troops tied down. Because while everyone's eyes were on the Mediterranean, the biggest military operation in Western history was being secretly assembled across the Channel in Britain. And in just a few months, the world would witness the largest single day of war it had ever seen. For 2 long years, Stalin had been screaming at Churchill and Roosevelt for one thing: a second front. The Soviet Union was bleeding millions of men holding back the Nazi war machine in the East, and the Western Allies kept promising a major invasion of France that just kept getting delayed. Behind the scenes, though, something extraordinary had been quietly taking shape across Britain. Codenamed Operation Overlord, this was going to be the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted in human history. Generals had been planning it for years. Tanks, ships, aircraft, fuel, and supplies were being stockpiled in southern England by the millions of tons. By the spring of 1944, Britain was so packed with men and machines that locals joked the only thing keeping the island from sinking was the barrage balloons holding it up. The planning was so detailed, it bordered on obsessive. Allied intelligence created an entire fake army under the command of General George Patton, complete with inflatable rubber tanks, fake radio traffic, and dummy landing craft, all designed to convince Hitler that the real invasion would come at Calais, the most logical crossing point. The actual target was Normandy, a stretch of coast Hitler considered too rough and too far for a major landing. The deception worked beautifully. Even after the invasion began, Hitler stubbornly held back his panzer reserves for weeks, convinced Normandy was a diversion. Folks have to appreciate the genius of this. The Allies didn't just plan the invasion, they planned the lie that would protect it. And the man in charge of pulling this entire impossible operation together was a Kansas farm boy turned 5-star general, Dwight D. Eisenhower. June 6, 1944. They called it the longest day, and they weren't kidding. In the dark hours before dawn, 24,000 American, British, and Canadian paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines to seize bridges, knock out artillery, and create chaos. Then, as the sun started to rise, an armada that staggers the imagination appeared off the Normandy coast. Nearly 7,000 ships, over 11,000 aircraft, 156,000 soldiers crammed into landing craft, getting violently seasick as they bobbed through choppy waters toward 5 beaches with code names that would ring through history forever: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. As the ramps dropped, young men in their late teens and early 20s stepped off into chest-deep water, machine gun fire screaming all around them, and ran straight into the meat grinder. Omaha Beach was the worst of them. American GIs of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions hit a beach defended by the toughest German units in Normandy, dug into cliffs honeycombed with bunkers and machine gun nests. Within minutes, entire boatloads of soldiers were killed before they could even reach the sand. The beach turned into a chaotic horror of blood, bodies, and burning vehicles. For hours, the entire invasion at Omaha hung by a thread. But here's something worth thinking about. Small groups of officers, sergeants, and ordinary privates somehow gathered themselves, pushed inland through minefields and barbed wire, and took out the German positions one by one. By the end of June 6th, despite over 4,400 Allied dead, the invasion had succeeded. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had bragged was unbreakable, had been broken in a single day. What followed was a brutal slugfest through the Norman countryside, full of dense hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. But the Allies kept grinding forward. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, with French citizens dancing in the streets and weeping openly as Allied tanks rolled past the Eiffel Tower. By December, however, Hitler tried one last desperate gamble: a massive surprise counterattack through the Ardennes forest, the same place he'd struck France back in 1940. This became the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land battle ever fought by the U.S. Army, where American GIs froze and bled in the worst winter Europe had seen in decades. They held the line at places like Bastogne, where the surrounded American commander, when asked to surrender by the Germans, gave a now legendary one-word reply: nuts. By early 1945, the Allies had crossed the German border and were closing in from the west. But on the other side of Germany, an even larger force was crashing toward Berlin like an avalanche. The Soviets were coming, and they wanted blood. While the Western Allies were fighting their way through France in the summer of 1944, something even bigger and far bloodier was unfolding in the East. To truly grasp the scale of the Eastern Front, folks need to sit with one staggering number for a moment. Of every 10 German soldiers killed in World War II, roughly 8 died fighting the Soviets. The Eastern Front wasn't just a theater of the war, it was the war, the meat grinder where Hitler's army was actually destroyed. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, the Red Army began a relentless westward push that would last over 2 years and cover more than 1,000 miles. And leading it was a transformed Soviet military. No longer the disorganized victim of 1941, but a hardened, brutal war machine. The decisive moment in the East came in the summer of 1943 at a Russian city called Kursk. Hitler, desperate to regain the initiative, gathered nearly 1 million men and 2,700 tanks for what he hoped would be the knockout blow that turned the tide back in Germany's favor. But Soviet intelligence had cracked the plan in advance, and Stalin's generals had spent months building the most fortified defensive position in human history. 8 layers of trenches, minefields packed with over 1 million mines, and thousands of anti-tank guns hidden in the wheat fields. When the Germans attacked on July 5th, they walked straight into a trap. The resulting clash, including the massive tank battle at Prokhorovka, became the largest armored engagement ever fought. The Wehrmacht lost the cream of its remaining panzer forces, and from that day forward, the Germans would never again launch a major offensive in the East. What followed was something the Soviets dryly called the 10 Stalinist blows, a series of massive coordinated offensives in 1944 that systematically smashed German army group after German army group. The most spectacular was Operation Bagration in June 1944, launched almost simultaneously with D-Day. While the Western world watched Normandy, the Soviets unleashed 1.7 million men against the German Army Group Center in Belarus. Within weeks, they had completely destroyed it, a defeat far larger than Stalingrad, with German losses exceeding 400,000 men. The Red Army advanced 450 miles in just 2 months, reaching the gates of Warsaw. For the German High Command, it was an apocalypse. The supposedly invincible Wehrmacht was being shattered piece by piece, and there was no longer any way to stop the avalanche heading toward Berlin. But here's the thing about war on the Eastern Front. It wasn't just battles. It was a war of total annihilation, fueled by the deepest hatred. German soldiers had spent 3 years committing unspeakable atrocities in Soviet territory. Entire villages had been burned, civilians massacred, prisoners worked to death by the millions. As the Red Army crossed back into Germany itself in early 1945, that long-burning rage exploded into vengeance. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had lost their entire families to the Nazi invasion, unleashed horrors of their own. Mass rapes of German women, looting, and summary executions across East Prussia and Silesia. It was a horrifying chapter, and folks who study this period have to face the uncomfortable truth that even on the side of liberation, the human cost included terrible crimes. The Eastern Front produced no clean heroes, just survivors. By April 1945, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers were converging on Berlin from 3 directions, supported by 6,000 tanks and over 7,000 aircraft. The defenders of the German capital were a desperate, broken collection of exhausted veterans, teenage Hitler Youth boys, and old men in the Volkssturm militia, many armed with nothing more than single-shot anti-tank weapons. The Battle of Berlin became one of the bloodiest urban battles in history, fought street by street, building by building, sewer by sewer. Deep underground in his concrete bunker, Hitler descended into final madness, ordering imaginary armies to counterattack and screaming at his generals about phantom victories. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops just blocks away, Adolf Hitler shot himself. 8 days later, Germany formally surrendered. The war in Europe was finally over, but across the world, in the smoldering ruins of the Pacific, the most apocalyptic chapter of the entire conflict was about to begin, one that would change the very nature of warfare forever. While Berlin burned and Europe celebrated, the war in the Pacific was still very much alive and getting worse by the day. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a country in ruins. American B-29 bombers were torching its cities night after night. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other urban areas had been reduced to ashes. The Imperial Navy was at the bottom of the Pacific. Most of Japan's overseas conquests had been ripped away. By every rational measure, Japan had lost the war. But here's the thing. Nobody outside Japan fully understood at the time. The Japanese leadership wasn't operating on rational measures. They were operating on a code of honor that valued death over surrender, and they were prepared to fight until the very last civilian. Behind the scenes, in absolute secrecy, the United States had been pouring billions of dollars and the brainpower of its greatest scientists into something nobody else on Earth knew existed. The Manhattan Project had started back in 1942, when Roosevelt got word that Nazi Germany might be working on a similar weapon. Led by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, a small army of scientists worked across hidden laboratories in places like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. They were trying to do something that had only existed in the equations of theoretical physics: split the atom and release the energy locked inside it. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, they tested their first device. The flash was so bright it could be seen from over 200 miles away. Oppenheimer, watching the mushroom cloud rise, famously thought of a line from the Bhagavad Gita: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." President Harry Truman, who'd only become president a few months earlier when Roosevelt died suddenly in April 1945, now faced one of the most agonizing decisions any leader has ever made. American military planners estimated that an invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, could cost up to 1 million American casualties and several million Japanese lives. The fanatical resistance at Iwo Jima and Okinawa had made it brutally clear what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would look like. Truman gave the order. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named the Enola Gay dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. In one blinding flash, roughly 80,000 people were killed instantly, and the city was flattened. Tens of thousands more would die in the weeks and months ahead from burns and radiation sickness. Japan still didn't surrender. The Japanese cabinet was deadlocked, with hardliners insisting they could still fight on. So 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 people instantly. That same day, the Soviet Union, true to a promise made at the Yalta Conference, declared war on Japan and invaded Japanese-held Manchuria. Now it wasn't just American bombs falling. A massive Soviet army was steamrolling Japan's last major land force. Even then, the Japanese cabinet was still split, debating whether to surrender. It took the personal intervention of Emperor Hirohito himself, who finally broke the deadlock by recording a radio address, to convince his government to accept the inevitable. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the very first time in history, broadcast across the country in a recorded message announcing the war was over. He didn't say the word surrender. That would have been too humiliating. Instead, he told his people that the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the formal surrender. World War II, after 6 years and roughly 60 million deaths, was finally over. But the ethical questions raised by those 2 atomic bombs would echo through the rest of human history. Were they necessary to end the war? Could a demonstration have been enough? Was unleashing such horror on civilians ever justifiable? Historians, ethicists, and ordinary people are still arguing about it today. And as the smoke cleared and the world emerged from the deadliest conflict it had ever known, it became clear that the war was over, but the consequences were just beginning. When the guns finally fell silent in September 1945, the world that emerged from the ashes of World War II was almost unrecognizable. Roughly 60 million people were dead, including nearly 40 million civilians. Entire cities lay in rubble. Whole economies had collapsed. Tens of millions of refugees wandered across the ruins of Europe, searching for homes and families that no longer existed. 6 years of total war had reshaped the planet in ways nobody had time to fully process. And one of the most urgent questions facing the victors was simple but unprecedented. What do you do with the men who orchestrated history's greatest crimes? You couldn't just put them in front of a firing squad and call it a day. The world needed something bigger. The world needed justice on the record. The answer was Nuremberg. And folks, what happened in that courtroom genuinely changed international law forever. Starting in November 1945, 24 senior Nazi leaders were put on trial in the very same German city where Hitler had once held his massive party rallies. For the first time in history, men were prosecuted not just for waging war, but for crimes against humanity, a brand new legal concept invented to handle the unique horror of what the Nazis had done. Photographs from the death camps were entered as evidence. Survivors testified. Documents the Nazis themselves had kept, in their characteristic obsession with paperwork, condemned them in their own words. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death. Hermann Göring, in classic defiant fashion, swallowed a hidden cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled hanging. The principle established at Nuremberg was revolutionary. Just following orders was no longer a defense. Individuals were responsible for their actions, no matter their rank. Out of all that horror emerged something hopeful, something the world had failed to build after World War I. On October 24, 1945, 51 nations gathered in San Francisco and signed the charter creating the United Nations. The whole idea was to make sure something like the Holocaust, something like another world war, could never happen again. The League of Nations had failed because it had no teeth, and the United States had refused to join. The UN was different. America was a founding member this time, and the new organization had a Security Council with real power. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, would become a foundational document of the modern era. None of this was perfect, and the UN has had plenty of failures since. But for the first time, humanity at least tried to build a system to prevent its own self-destruction. Then came the strangest twist in this entire story. The 2 countries that had crushed Nazi Germany together, the United States and the Soviet Union, almost immediately became bitter enemies. They had fundamentally different visions for the post-war world. America wanted democracies, free markets, and self-determination. Stalin wanted communist buffer states surrounding the Soviet Union and rejected anything that smelled of capitalism. By 1946, Churchill stood at a podium in Missouri and declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Germany itself was split in 2, a democratic West Germany supported by the Allies, and a communist East Germany controlled by the Soviets. Berlin, sitting deep inside East Germany, was carved up the same way, and would later be physically divided by a concrete wall in 1961 that became the most famous symbol of this new struggle. This new conflict, the Cold War, would dominate the next 4 decades of human history. Nuclear weapons, which had ended World War II, now multiplied into arsenals capable of destroying civilization many times over. Proxy wars erupted in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and across Africa and Latin America, with millions dying as the superpowers fought each other through smaller nations. The space race, the arms race, the spy games, the constant fear of mutual annihilation. All of it traced directly back to decisions made in the smoking ruins of 1945. World War II had ended, but its long shadow stretched into every corner of modern life. Almost every border on a map today, every major international institution, every alliance that shapes geopolitics, every nuclear weapon that exists, all of it can be traced back to those 6 brutal years between 1939 and 1945. The deadliest war in human history didn't just end an era, it built the modern world we're still living in today. And that's the story. 6 years. 60 million lives. 6 continents touched by violence on a scale humanity had never imagined, and hopefully will never see again. World War II wasn't just the deadliest conflict in human history. It was the moment the modern world was forged in fire. Every border on a map today, every alliance that holds the global order together, every nuclear weapon stockpiled in silent silos around the world, every international institution from the UN to NATO. All of it traces back to the choices made between 1939 and 1945. To understand the world we're living in right now, folks have to understand the war that built it. But here's the part nobody likes to talk about. The real lesson of World War II isn't just about tanks, generals, and battles. It's about how quickly civilization can come apart when people stop paying attention. How a humiliated nation can fall under the spell of a charismatic monster. How peace for our time can become a war for all time. How ordinary men in suits, drinking coffee in nice rooms, can sign documents that murder millions. The patterns that led the world into this nightmare didn't die in 1945. They're still out there, in every corner of every century. The question is whether humanity is paying close enough attention to recognize them when they show up again. And share this with someone who needs to know this story. Because history isn't just something that happened. It's something that keeps happening, in new forms, in new places, with new faces. The only thing standing between humanity and the next nightmare is whether enough of us remember the last one. And if you've made it this far with me, that's exactly the kind of person the world needs more of. See you in the next one.
That's the end of this video. Would you like to see more of it? I hope so. Let me know in the comments.